everybody, and welcome to this revision video on neurons as part of the neuropsychology topic for Stage 1 psychology. Let's get started. So neurons are individual nerve cells that transmit information around the body. So you can see here we focus on three main ones in Stage 1 psychology: the motor neuron, the sensory neuron, and the interneuron. So sensory neurons, pictured here in the middle, send messages from the sense receptors to the brain. So when it receives external stimuli from our environment, it will then send messages from the sense receptors in our eyes, our nose, our ears, mouth, skin, etc., to the brain in order to process that information. So it's processing the senses or sensory information it is receiving. Now, motor neurons, pictured here, this is often the one that you will see. It sends messages from the brain to the muscles. So they are the longest cells in the human body because they need to get the messages to the different parts of the body very, very quickly. Hence, they need to be long. And then the intraneurons connect the sensory and motor neurons together to allow the transmission of messages to occur effectively and quickly. So imagine that your mobile phone rings. So a range of sensory neurons are immediately activated. So the cells in your ear will detect the ringtone, the cells in your eyes will also see the screen light up, and obviously the cells in your skin detect the vibration of your phone. So when the screen lights up, sensory tissue in your eye is also activated, as I've said. These messages are all sent to the brain, which then processes them and determines an appropriate response. So these are our sensory neurons. Then our motor neurons will send messages to the muscles in our arm and fingers to press the answer button and raise the phone to your ear. And then the motor neurons also activate the muscles in your vocal cords so that you can produce the speech necessary to greet your caller by saying hello or another greeting. So in this way, your nervous system acts to coordinate complex, well-timed, and very fluid responses to the stimuli presented. So all of this happens very, very quickly in order for certain functions and actions to be able to be done. So this is the structure of a typical neuron. So this is a motor neuron that we see here, and it's made up of different parts, which we will go through in this video. So what are the different parts you need to know? So we focus on the axon, the dendrite, the soma or cell body, the myelin sheath or myelin, it's often seen as well, both are correct, the axon terminal, and the nucleus. So let's look at these in more detail. So starting with the dendrites, so they detect and receive neural information. So once we hear our phone ring or we receive some other sensory information, it's our dendrites that receive the incoming information from other neurons and transmit the information to the soma cell or the cell body. So the soma or cell body includes the nucleus, and that's the part of the neuron that determines whether the neuron will be activated and transmit the messages. So we're constantly bombarded with sensory information and sensory input. So it'll be the cell body or soma with the nucleus that determines should this message actually be activated and should it be acted upon, essentially. So just like other cells that you would have learnt about, the cell body plus the nucleus or the soma is the brain of the cell and coordinates and determines whether the neuron will be activated and actually transmit the message or not. Then we have the axon. So the axon is a single tube-like extension that transmits the messages from the soma to other cells in the body. So it goes down the single light tube extension here, ready to go to the axon terminal to transmit the message to another neighboring axon over the synaptic gap, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, the myelin sheath is the protectant that is around the axon. So the axon of neurons are surrounded by a myelin sheath. Sometimes this is just called the myelin, which is fine as well. So it's a white fatty covering that helps insulate the axon. So it's often likened to that of electrical wires. So the axon is the actual wire itself, and the myelin sheath is the protective coating around the wires. It's a very, very similar analogy. So our myelin sheath occurs in segments that are separated by small gaps called nodes where the myelin is missing. So as you can see here, the axon is protected by the fatty white coverings of the myelin sheath or myelin. And this is obviously to help protect it, to allow the messages to be transmitted effectively. So just on that, so a normal nerve, the myelin sheath is intact, the messages will move quickly, as you can see here. But when they're damaged, so when the myelin sheath is damaged or destroyed, the messages will move much more slowly because it obviously can't get through down the axon effectively. And this is what causes multiple sclerosis, or MS, which is what I'll talk about in a separate video. So getting to the axon terminal, or the synaptic button, it's often referred to as well. So at the end of each axon are branches, all right, that are these axon terminals. So each axon terminal has a small knob-like swelling at the tip called a synaptic button. So these are small sacs that store neurotransmitters, which again I'll talk about in a separate video, but they store the neurotransmitters ready to be transmitted to the neighboring neuron. So neurotransmitters are chemicals used in the transmission of information from one neuron to another. And the synapse is the very small gap between two neurons. So this is where the neurotransmitter transmission occurs, over the synaptic gap. It's often referred to as well, as you can see here. So you have the synaptic vessels, okay, or if we just go back here, the synaptic buttons, all right, which store the neurotransmitters. It then goes over the synaptic gap and then is received by the dendrites of the neighboring neuron, which is what we started talking about in this video. So that is the neuron in terms of this topic, okay? So we talked about it in terms of a motor neuron, but the other neurons work exactly the same way, with the same parts to them, as you can see, slightly arranged differently, as you would have seen at the beginning of the video, but those are the main parts of the neuron that you need to know about. So I hope you found this video useful. As always, if you've got any questions, feel free to email me or ask me in class. Otherwise, happy revising.